Do you know what has taken women's sexual freedom? Today, Freud is going to explain something absolutely bizarre about hysteria and pleasure that will completely change how you see the history of women's liberation. But here's what's mind-blowing. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis himself, accidentally triggered the sexual revolution for women, and he never even realized it. In fact, what he thought was a medical cure for female hysteria became the very thing that would free women sexually forever. How is it possible that the man who created some of the most controversial theories about female sexuality was completely blind to the revolution he was starting? And why did Victorian society desperately try to hide what was really happening in those doctors' offices? Freud wasn't just any doctor. He was the revolutionary mind who dared to talk about sex when society considered it taboo. He studied under Jean-Martin Charcot, witnessed thousands of hysteria treatments, and developed theories that shocked the world. But even this genius of human psychology missed the most obvious thing happening right in front of his eyes. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the shocking medical treatment that Victorian doctors performed on women daily, how a simple invention to help tired doctors accidentally created the modern adult toy industry, the exact moment when Freud's medical theories collided with women's sexual awakening, and why this accidental revolution reveals something profound about male psychology that even Freud couldn't see. This isn't just another history lesson, it's the untold story of how women's sexual freedom was born from the most unexpected source. And by the end, you'll understand why this changes everything we thought we knew about the origins of female liberation. The diagnosis of hysteria. Let's start with what Freud and his contemporaries actually believed about women's minds and bodies in the late 1800s. Picture this: you're a woman in Victorian society. You feel anxious, you're frustrated with your limited life options. Maybe you're sexually unsatisfied in your marriage. What does society tell you? That you have a disease called hysteria. The word itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. Yes, they literally believed women's problems came from their wombs wandering around their bodies. Freud initially bought into this, but he was about to revolutionize it in ways he never imagined. In Freud's early career, he worked with Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Charcot was famous for his theatrical demonstrations of hysterical women. These weren't just medical consultations. They were public spectacles where women would be hypnotized and display dramatic symptoms for an audience of male doctors. But here's what's fascinating. Freud was already noticing something his colleagues missed. While other doctors focused on the dramatic physical symptoms, Freud started listening to what these women were actually saying. They talked about sexual frustration, unfulfilled desires, and trapped emotions. However, and this is crucial, Freud still believed these women needed to be cured. He saw their sexual desires as pathological rather than natural. This blindness to women's genuine sexual needs would become the foundation of his biggest oversight. The diagnostic criteria for hysteria was incredibly broad. A woman could be diagnosed for being too emotional, too sexual, not sexual enough, disobedient to her husband, or even for reading too many novels. Essentially, any woman who didn't fit the perfect Victorian mold could be labeled hysterical. What Freud didn't realize was that he was documenting not mental illness, but the psychological effects of sexual and social oppression. The symptoms he was cataloging were actually signs of women's natural sexuality fighting against societal suppression. Medical treatment. Now here's where things get really bizarre and where Freud's blindness becomes most obvious. The standard treatment for female hysteria was called pelvic massage or hysterical paroxysm therapy. In plain English, doctors were manually stimulating women to orgasm as a medical procedure. Picture the scene: respectable Victorian doctors in their formal medical offices, with their sleeves rolled up, manually bringing women to what we now know was sexual climax. But here's the incredible part. They genuinely believed they were treating a medical condition, not providing sexual pleasure. The medical literature of the time describes the hysterical paroxysm, what we now know was an orgasm, as a therapeutic release that would calm the patient's symptoms. Doctors wrote clinical notes about muscular contractions, flushed skin, and temporary exhaustion without ever acknowledging they were describing sexual response. Freud himself performed these treatments early in his career, but even as he transitioned away from this physical approach toward his talking cure, he completely missed what was really happening. He was so focused on the psychological aspects that he failed to see the obvious. These women weren't sick. They were sexually starved. The treatments were incredibly popular. Women would return weekly, sometimes more frequently. They'd travel long distances to see doctors who specialized in this therapy. Waiting lists were months long. But the medical establishment explained this demand as proof of how widespread the hysteria epidemic was, not as evidence that women were seeking sexual satisfaction they couldn't get elsewhere. What's most shocking is how normalized this became. Medical textbooks included detailed instructions on proper technique. There were academic debates about the most effective methods. Some doctors even advertised their expertise in treating hysteria. But here's where Freud's psychological insight should have kicked in, and didn't. He was studying these same women, hearing them talk about their desires and frustrations, yet he never connected that the cure was simply giving them the sexual satisfaction they craved. Instead, he developed complex theories about repressed sexuality, while missing the simple fact that the cure was just sex, the accidental invention. But doctors had a problem, and this is where Freud's blindness becomes even more obvious. Performing these manual treatments was exhausting work. Doctors complained of hand fatigue, wrist pain, and the sheer time consumption. Some physicians were seeing dozens of hysterical women per day. The treatment that was supposedly curing these women was wearing out the doctors. In 1869, an American physician named George Taylor invented the first mechanical solution, a steam-powered table called the manipulator. This massive contraption used steam power to create vibrations that could be applied to patients. Imagine a Victorian woman lying on what was essentially a vibrating steam engine, while her doctor operated the controls from a distance. But technology was advancing quickly. By the 1880s, the first electric vibrators appeared in medical offices. These devices were marketed specifically to doctors as labor-saving medical equipment. The advertisements were purely clinical, showing proper therapeutic positioning and promising to reduce physician fatigue. Here's what's incredible. At this exact same time, Freud was developing his theories about the unconscious mind and repressed sexuality. He was literally surrounded by evidence that women had powerful sexual needs, yet he interpreted this through the lens of pathology. The medical vibrator industry exploded. By 1900, the vibrator was one of the first household electrical appliances, appearing in homes even before the vacuum cleaner or electric iron. Mail-order catalogs advertised them as health devices for treating female troubles. Women began purchasing these devices for home use, ostensibly for medical self-treatment. But what was really happening was revolutionary. For the first time in history, women had private access to sexual satisfaction independent of men. Freud was studying female psychology during this exact period, yet he completely missed this technological revolution happening in his own field. While he was writing complex theories about penis envy and female sexual development, millions of women were discovering their own sexual agency through these medical devices. The irony is staggering. Freud would later write extensively about how civilization suppressed natural sexual instincts, yet he failed to recognize that his own medical training had accidentally created the tools for female sexual liberation. He was literally prescribing the cure for sexual oppression while theorizing about why women were inherently more neurotic than men. Here's the incredible irony that Freud completely missed, and it reveals something profound about male psychology that even the father of psychoanalysis couldn't see. While Freud was developing his theories about female sexuality being inherently more complex and problematic than male sexuality, women were quietly experiencing a sexual revolution right under his nose. By the early 1900s, what started as medical treatment had transformed into something completely different. Women were no longer passive patients receiving therapy. They were active consumers purchasing devices for private use. The medical justification was becoming a transparent excuse. But here's what's most revealing about Freud's blindness. He was so invested in his role as the expert on female psychology that he couldn't see women's actual lived experience. He theorized that women had weaker sex drives than men, while simultaneously working in a field where the demand for sexual treatment was so high, it created an entire industry. The transformation was happening everywhere. Beauty salons began offering therapeutic massage services. Health spas advertised treatments for female nervous conditions. The language remained medical, but the reality was obvious to everyone except the male medical establishment. Women were also beginning to talk differently about their experiences. Instead of describing symptoms of illness, they started using language of wellness and vitality. They spoke about feeling energized, refreshed, and restored after treatments. This shift reveals something crucial that Freud missed. Women weren't suffering from a psychological disorder. They were suffering from sexual suppression imposed by society. When given access to sexual satisfaction, the symptoms of hysteria mysteriously disappeared. The most telling evidence, as social attitudes toward sexuality began changing in the early 1900s and women gained more sexual freedom in their marriages, the epidemic of hysteria started declining. The medical establishment credited better understanding of psychological factors, but the real reason was simpler. Women were getting their sexual needs met elsewhere. Freud continued to theorize about female sexual dysfunction and the complexity of feminine psychology, while the evidence all around him suggested that women's sexuality was actually quite straightforward. They just needed the freedom and tools to express it. By the 1920s, the medical vibrator began disappearing from catalogs as it became associated with sexuality rather than medical treatment. The cure had become too obviously sexual to maintain the medical facade. But by then, the damage to Victorian sexual repression was done. Women had discovered they didn't need medical permission to pursue sexual satisfaction. So, there you have it. The man who claimed to understand the depths of human sexual psychology was completely blind to the sexual revolution happening in his own medical practice. Freud spent decades theorizing about why women were more neurotic and sexually complex than men, while the evidence all around him showed that women's problems disappeared when they simply got the sexual satisfaction they needed. Sometimes the most brilliant minds miss the most obvious truths, and in this case, that blindness accidentally freed an entire gender from centuries of sexual oppression.